welcome to 5 Frames From. Today I'm talking about the 2009 film District 9, which was written and directed by Neill Blomkamp. Now this is a mid-budget science fiction film but deals with some really big issues, including ideas about society's over-reliance on big multinational corporations, society's dependence on kind of weaponry in order to win war, and the desire to have the best weaponry. Probably the most important idea that it discusses is apartheid in South Africa. And we would call this an allegory. The political issue of apartheid is reflected in the setting and also the name of the film, but also most obviously in the segregation of the aliens and the humans. Having said all of that, it's also a hugely entertaining film. It's graphic and gory and full of visual effects, and it does a huge amount with its small budget. Science fiction has always asked difficult questions about what it is to be human, and District 9 is no exception. What it does do differently is tackle serious issues of racism, segregation and apartheid. In particular, it's based on that apartheid era of history in South Africa. I said this is reflected in the title District 9. This links to District 6, which was an area in Cape Town which was declared to be for whites only. And that's also seen in the promotional material. So for example here you can see no humans allowed. So really reflecting that moment in history. And these posters, along with many others, formed part of a massive viral marketing campaign. District 9 is based on a short film that Blomkamp had already made called Alive in Joburg, and a lot of the ideas from that short film are developed further in District 9. The documentary style filmmaking, the fake interviews, the alien costumes and so on, all featured in that earlier short. Undoubtedly having Peter Jackson on board really helped with the promotion of the film, and there are loads of clips online of him talking about the film and Neill Blomkamp as a director on YouTube. But largely he was hands-off in the process, and making the film this way outside of the constraints of Hollywood and any kind of studio system undoubtedly gave Neill Blomkamp the opportunity to really express a sort of visual flair, a lot of freedom in creating the film. Blomkamp is a self-confessed science fiction fan. Science fiction is a genre full of hybridity, therefore sort of expanding its appeal to a wider audience. If you research online, you'll find that people have described District 9 as a mockumentary, as a buddy movie, as political satire, a techno thriller, splatter film. And of course, we've got to mention the traditional sort of action film. There's lots of action sequences. For me, one thing that stands out is the intertextuality. We could argue this is very much a postmodern science fiction film. So films that are mentioned that have intertextual references here are things like Starship Troopers, Alien Nation, Enemy Mine. Now I have to confess I've not seen any of those. The biggest intertextual link for me though is to The Fly, where Jeff Goldblum undergoes this transformation into a fly, and we see things like his teeth fall out and his fingernails come out, and that's very much what we see in District 9 as the change happens to Vikas. So before I give any more spoilers away, apologies if you haven't seen the film yet, I'm going to crack on with my first frame. So the first frame that I've chosen is from the beginning of the film. And I think it's a really, really clever opening, and actually a really clever film in terms of what it does with its budget. By using documentary conventions, it's able to go quite low tech in terms of camera work and save all its money for sort of the effects of the spaceship and the design of the prawns, which is CGI. But this opening, this start of the film really establishes Vikas as a character, and the film is very clever in manipulating the audience and how we feel about Vikas as a character, because at this point I love Vikas. And who wouldn't? Look at his costume there with his sort of brown tie and his brown tank top. He's obviously not a man who considers fashion. He's not power dressing, so he's not wearing a suit, so he's obviously not very high up in the company that he's working for. And there's a sense that he's been put upon a little bit in making this documentary. He talks about his wife encouraging him to do it. So the mise en scène sort of establishes him as a bit of a lovable loser, really. And the things that he says about his family, he's quite clearly a family man. He's a bit of a nice guy. And so we're sort of rooting for him early on. We've got a mid shot with Vickers in the foreground. We've got all the office paraphernalia in the background. It's very much documentary style. And this also links to the fact that we've got asynchronous sound at the beginning. We hear the voiceover of the documentary maker, and we see Vickers sort of asking questions about where he should sit and so on. The use of ambient sound and ambient lighting really creates a sort of realistic look to the sequence. We're convinced that what we're seeing is real. Of course, that then contrasts heavily with what we see in the next few shots when we see the alien ship over Johannesburg. The use of on-screen graphics, the MNU logo and Vickers' name, convinces us even more that this is a documentary. It gives it a really sort of official feel, and we need to remember that this is meant to be a sort of promotional video for the company, which of course we know goes horribly wrong. Vickers tells us that he is part of Alien Affairs. He introduces the team around him. Again, he's very lovable in that he comes across as a team member. But ultimately, he's on screen for sort of less than a minute here, and we've already got this idea of who he is and whether we like him. We certainly do feel some connection with him. We're aligned with him. He's the first character we see. And of course, as his demise comes about, that really makes us feel that empathy for him as a character, and we're sort of rooting for him to succeed, even though at times he behaves pretty badly, and I'll talk about that later. The performance of Sharlto Copley is very natural. It's very convincing. He has said that he improvised a lot of his lines, and we might say that he favours the method acting approach in that he totally immersed himself in his character. So overall, this is a really effective opening to the film, persuading the audience that we're about to see one thing when actually it goes in a completely different direction. For my second frame, I've chosen this extreme long shot of the alien spaceship. This also acts as an establishing shot. We're finally seeing the city that the story is based in. The footage itself, again, we've got these on-screen graphics giving us the day, a sort of time stamp. And the footage has got a slightly more grainy quality, suggesting that this is found footage, that it's been filmed on a home video recorder by people observing the event. So this gives us a sense of how unusual the event was, how people reacted to the event, and it still creates that sense of realism. Of course, for the audience though, we now know that this isn't real, this isn't a documentary, because otherwise we'd have heard of it in real life. So we're now taken into this story world. And perhaps this is the moment of disruption in a narrative structure that has come before the film itself. So obviously Vickers' story, we see an equilibrium, we're going to see disruption a bit later on, but actually the people in Johannesburg have already been disrupted and there's already a story in play there. Now I've actually chosen a second shot to complement this one, because this second shot is the one that really makes me have a visceral reaction when they're finally inside the spaceship and we see all this sludgy, disgusting stuff on the floor. We assume that it's vomit and poo and just all of these kind of bodily fluids that have had nowhere to go while the aliens have been trapped in the spaceship. So it's a pretty gross moment when they finally do break in, and obviously sets up this idea that the authorities in South Africa have some sort of responsibility for the aliens. This shot is a high angle shot, probably a point of view shot from someone coming into the spaceship itself. It's still got that sense of kind of found footage, it's recording that's happening at the time, because again we've got those on-screen graphics, but also the kind of position of the camera emphasises that too. The white boot shows that the people coming onto the ship need to protect themselves, that they're wary of what's inside. And also the use of the colour white really contrasts with all the muck and disgusting stuff on the floor. We've got this low-key lighting throughout. There's a use of spotlights throughout the scene before the aliens are actually revealed. So there's quite a lot of build-up until the aliens are actually seen. Both of these shots have a slightly unbalanced feel. The shot of the boot, the close-up of the boot, slightly more unbalanced than the one of the ship, but it isn't quite in the centre of the frame. And these unbalanced shots probably create a sense of discomfort for the viewer. They suggest something is about to happen that isn't going to be pleasant. All the while, there's this voiceover again. We've got these expert opinions from male and female scientists who've done studies. They're talking in the past tense, so they're recounting the story and giving us all this information about the aliens themselves. Again, this is playing with audience expectations because we're not used to seeing aliens being revealed in this way. We could argue that the first shot here is reminiscent and perhaps an intertextual reference to something like Independence Day, where the ship hovers over the White House for ages and has to be destroyed. In those types of films and in lots of science fiction films, the aliens are a threat, they're a danger to the people on Earth. But what we're seeing here is the aliens as vulnerable, and this is really unusual within the science fiction genre. Again, as an audience, this is playing with our expectations because we really don't know where this film is going now, how this is going to pan out. There's a lot of ambient sound as they break into the ship, and not a huge amount of dialogue, but one of the things that we do hear is someone saying, "Oh my God," when he's stepping in all the filth. And I think in that phrase, we really hear the disgust in his voice, which again sets up this idea that there are going to be problems with what to do with these aliens that are ill and dirty and underfed. This is a huge problem that needs to be resolved. So this actually is a film full of enigma, and we might already be thinking about how Vickers and the aliens are linked, what's going to happen to the aliens, how is this film going to progress. So for my third frame, I've chosen this frame of one of the aliens, and to be honest, I could have chosen lots of different frames here because many of them show the aliens behaving in pretty unpleasant ways. And I'm just using this shot really to illustrate the point that, again, the spectator's relationship with the character of the prawn is quite complicated. They deliberately look horrible and they do horrible things. So here you can see the prawn sort of butchering some meat. They're easily controlled with the cat food, easily manipulated, easily evicted from their homes. They're pretty unpleasant in that they quickly react violently to situations, and their language is pretty fruity too. So there's not a lot to like about the prawn, and they form a clear binary opposition to the humans. Although we could argue that actually the human behaviour and the prawn behaviour is really quite similar towards the end. And yet we do form a connection with some of the aliens later on, particularly Christopher and his son. Their desire to get their equipment working and get back to their own planet is perfectly reasonable. And of course Christopher becomes an ally to Vickers later on in the film. The mise-en-scène here also illustrates some of the living conditions. We do actually, in other shots, get to see more of this. We can see the graffiti on the wall. We can tell it's a place that's sort of uncared for. It's a slum area that the aliens have been put into. I think Blomkamp was very specific about what time of year he wanted to film so that he could really get a sense of almost an apocalyptic look to South Africa that really looks quite barren and dry and dirty, and there's just no positive effects in that slum area. So much so that there are even gangsters there exploiting the prawns with cat food. So the look of the alien, which is computer generated, I think there are some visual effects later when Vickers is turning into an alien, is pretty hard to stomach. It's meant to make us feel sort of scared, disgusted, a disconnect from it, but at the same time the emotions and the behaviour and the language, because they do understand English, is supposed to make us feel a connection with them. And all the while the film does loads of over-the-top, overblown things. That connection to the alien but also to the human makes it more complex for the audience to be involved with. My fourth frame is this one of Vickers, and this is just when he's found the shed full of alien eggs and he's really excited about it. He's really excited about the find. I've chosen this frame because for me this is where my opinions and response to Vickers really change. And we can see here he's smiling, he's talking to a trainee, and as he's talking, he's pulling out different kind of pipes and tubes which are feeding the alien eggs, and basically he's talking about abortion. And he talks to the other guy about keeping a souvenir of his first abortion. What's interesting here is when Vickers is in the weapon testing lab, he can't bring himself to shoot prawns. He says, I'll shoot a pig, but I won't shoot a prawn. And he can see the kind of violence and brutality of what he's doing. Here, when he's pulling out the plugs, he doesn't see these as living creatures. He doesn't see what he's doing as being problematic. He just terminates each egg. Later on, he's talking about them popping like popcorn, and he's like an excitable schoolboy because he's found such a big sight. So here we really see that Vickers is a flawed hero. His intentions are not heroic. He's behaving in line with what Emma New believes. We've also seen some quite sly behaviour in the build-up to this. So, for example, they're trying to evict the prawns from their homes. They have to get signatures, and he argues that a slap on the piece of paper as a prawn knocks it out of his hand counts as a signature. So he'll try all sorts of behaviour to get the job done. He's also really frightened of being in the slum. You know, he's talking about not making eye contact. He doesn't want any trouble. He uses the cat food as bribes. So there's all sorts of quite seedy behaviour that is not very likeable. And Vickers has changed from this lovable loser type character to more of a corporate job's worth who is keen to please the bosses and doesn't see the aliens as any kind of life form, more as just a problem to be solved. I think there's another point here about racism, or I guess we might call it speciesism, is so ingrained in society that even a likeable, harmless man can have these opinions so deeply ingrained that he doesn't even question his behaviour at this point. He just kills the babies of an entire other species and sees that as part of doing his job. However, I do think the audience question his behaviour, and perhaps this is where our opinions start to change, not just of Vickers, because as I've said, he's less likeable now, but maybe we've got more sympathy for the aliens, more understanding of their plight, more understanding of how they're being treated and how unfair that is. And even though their behaviour is violent and aggressive, actually it feels much more justified in terms of what's happening to them. So this is what I mean about the relationship with the audience being really complex. Our thoughts and feelings are changing. We're being challenged to think about our own prejudices and what we believe is right and wrong. So in terms of camera work, we've still got the documentary aesthetic. We've got lots of handheld camera in this scene in the slum and lots of kind of reaction to what's going on. So we see a lot of movement, pans and tilts to follow the action. So for my final frame, I'm going to be honest and say that I couldn't really choose one, and actually I'm going to talk about a few different frames here. My first thought was to use this high angle aerial shot, which presumably is meant to be sort of the point of view of a helicopter sort of news team looking down on the events that have been going on. And again, this is a shot that adds to the realism and the documentary style. In the mise-en-scène, we can see more of that slum aesthetic that I was talking about before. But more importantly, the point to make here is this is where Vickers has really made that transition to prawn. He still physically doesn't completely look like a prawn. And there's a second image coming up now which shows some of those visual effects, that makeup and what they've done to him to really capture that bizarre look of change from human to prawn. But he obviously is considered to be sort of part of the prawn group, because here we've got about 5 different aliens gathered around him, protecting him from the South African guard who has decided to kill him. So again, we've got another transition for Vickers. He's moved from human to alien in terms of who his allies actually are. Now, these scenes in the slums towards the end are pretty gruesome. We've got that splatter effect of kind of blood on the screen. In another shot similar to this top one, we see the South African guard's kind of body being pulled apart, his limbs coming off. So it's all pretty gruesome. In the close-up of Vickers here, we can really see his facial expression. He looks frightened, he looks shell-shocked, he can't believe what's happened to him. And this is a huge contrast to the other shot that I thought about having as my final frame, which is this one of Vickers as the family man, and takes us right back to the very beginning of the film. So here he is holding up a picture of his wife to the camera and describing her as a genuine angel. So we're reminded of the Vickers that we used to like, the lovable loser from the very beginning. We're reminded he's a family man. It's taken us on a sort of circular route back to the beginning, but of course Vickers has completely changed, and that's what this other shot shows, is Vickers, the potential alien. There is some mystery about whether or not this really is him in his fully changed form, but certainly that's hinted at in the dialogue that we hear. So we've had all of this action and all of this excitement, but actually the film takes us back to these very sort of poignant moments where we're thinking about Vickers as a character, about what he's been through, how he's been manipulated by MNU, and what his new life must be like. And as the alien holds the rose and looks towards the camera, we sense that there's something different about this prawn, that actually it's more sensitive than a lot of the other aliens that we've seen. So is this Vickers? And therefore, does this mean we're going to get a sequel that explores him as a character and explores the idea that Christopher and his son might come back to Earth to rescue the alien race? And there's been a lot of talk about whether there will be a District 10 at some point in the future. So all the way to the very end, this film is giving us enigma, it's raising questions, and it's leaving us with questions that we might ponder as we come away from the screen, and things that we might talk about, creating that sort of water cooler moment after viewing. And this has been a huge hit with fans. There are specific wikis about District 9. There's all sorts of theories about the aliens. And of course, they make great cosplay costumes too. So it's worth having a little look at what the spectators' response has been to the film as a whole. Anyway, that's my 5 frames from District 9. I hope it's been useful. Please like and subscribe, and see you again soon. Bye.